で、次のペーパーも、これはデータベースの構築の、ダイレクトリーの構築の話ですけども、やっぱり長いこと、この EAJRS にご参加いただいているカナダの方からのファビアノ・ロサさんで。タイトルはこの Developing the Japanese Canadian Researchers Dictionary, Directory and Bibliography ですね。では、お願いいたします。
Hi, everyone. I think that most of you know me. My name is Fabiano Rocha. I'm the Japan Studies Librarian at the University of Toronto Libraries. Lisbon for me is a special place because it's the first time that I attended the EAJRS, so it's very nice to be back in 14 years, and also 3 years after the pandemic to see so many familiar faces and making few new friends. Today I'm going to be talking about my experience developing the Japanese Canadian Researchers Directory and Bibliography, and the way that I used an open access platform to achieve the goal that we had. I'm going to be talking about this project that was initiated by the Greater Toronto chapter of the National Association of Japanese Canadians. And the Greater Toronto chapter of the National Association of Japanese Canadians is a nonprofit organization whose objectives are to advance education about racial discrimination against Japanese Canadians. As you may know, we have a very a difficult history of Japanese Canadians during the World War II when they were interned, and later there was a lot of activity in order to get redress and an apology from the the Canadian government. It also looks at promoting racial equality and positive race relations. So a lot of the activities that they currently have are also in support of Indigenous peoples and other marginalized groups. This year, it's going to be celebrating the 75th anniversary since its establishment, and there's going to be a symposium that's going to be celebrating that in the end of October. And I'm also a member, a board of directors of the NAJC, and that's why this project was kind of thrown at me. I didn't have much choice, but actually to have to work on it. So the last project that they worked on, it's called the Hours to Tell project, and it was funded by the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. It kind of came out because of many conversations that were being had between academics as well as community leaders about the issues of ethics in research and in racialized and Indigenous communities. So there were many accounts of racialized researchers being marginalized and tokenized instead of being treated as scholars in their own right. So for example, they would actually be considered native informants as opposed to being included in the research process. And so there are lots of numerous and many accounts from Japanese Canadian researchers recently that reviewed this kind of systemic racism and tokenism. So in order to address those issues, the project's objectives included increasing the awareness of systemic issues in ethics of research, which was made via that project, that symposium, and then develop guidelines on how researchers who are outside, they are not Japanese Canadian themselves, can positively contribute to and be good allies in connecting those stories to issues of racism in Canada, and also develop some strategies for mentoring young Japanese researchers who are kind of starting their careers now. And what I'm going to be concentrating today is the creation of this reference tool to increase the visibility of Japanese Canadian researchers as well as their resources. And that brings us to the Japanese Canadian Researchers Directory and Bibliography. So this was also a way to honor Ken Adachi, who was a journalist himself, and he was the first person who wrote about the history of Japanese Canadians in 1977, when they were celebrating the 100 years of Japanese immigration to Canada. The first Japanese to immigrate to Canada was Manzo Nagano in 100 years before that, 1877. And that's the book that he wrote, The Enemy the Nabu Was, that also explained a lot of the difficulties of Japanese Canadians experiencing during the World War II. So that was one of the key outcomes that they were expected, which was the development of this database. And the primary purpose was to demonstrate the state of knowledge developed in the expertise and voice of Japanese Canadians perspective, and so that that could be used as a reference tool for any outsiders who are making decisions in policy, research, as well as funding, because that was very important for them to ensure that Japanese Canadian researchers in their own right would be considered for this type of funding opportunities as well. And so it's to ensure that adequate representation of Japanese Canadians in telling their own community stories. I have water, please. So, so the project team itself, it was very small. As you can see, there were 2 people working. I was the project team lead who had to come up with the kind of like overall structure. And then Bailey Irene Midori-Hoy was an undergraduate student in the Department of History. She's a Japanese Canadian herself of mixed race, Japanese Canadian as well as Chinese Canadian. And after she finished her undergraduate degree at the University of Toronto, now she's been accepted to work on Japanese Canadian history and doing a master's and pursuing a master's at the University of British Columbia. So we had to come up with a definition of what Japanese Canadian actually really meant. And in the context of the database, a Japanese Canadian is an individual who has Japanese ancestry of some sort. So it included people who were born in Canada, as well as those who immigrated to Canada. So you could become kind of a Nikkei, or if you're currently residing in Canada as well. And we also recognize that the experiences between first generation Issei who were in Canada before the war, as well as the ones who immigrated post-war, were quite different. So in the tagging system that I had to develop, we had to make that differentiation by, for example, Dr. Masajiro Miyazaki. He was there before the war, and he was also interned, and his experiences were quite different from Izumi Sakamoto, who is a professor of social work at the University of Toronto, and she immigrated to Canada much later after the World War II. So she gets a post-war Issei generation, and that's how we make that differentiation. This is a typical entry of a Japanese Canadian researcher, where you would see the name of the person, last name, followed by the first name and given names, and in parentheses, the word about. And then you can see that under the collection, any of the entries for Japanese Canadian researchers in the Japanese Canadian Researchers Directory collection. The tags are attributes that were given to specific researchers to talk a little bit about their issues of identification, what kind of generation they belonged, the field of research or interest that they had, affiliation, as well as the associated places. So some people had association to either Canada as well as the United States, some people to England, but they're all working on Japanese Canadian or kind of Nikkei issues. Then you would see some biographical information under the notes, and you can see that they're in quotation marks because they were taken from somewhere, and the sources both for the text and the image are given in the bottom of the record. Oops. Now, in terms of scope, originally we were asked to actually work on creating a bibliography of Japanese Canadian history alone, but we thought that it was very important because Japanese Canadians are involved in many facets of research and scholarship. So we expanded the scope of the project to include works of fiction as well, recognizing that there's a richness of research conducted by literary authors who do a lot of historical fiction, exploring the themes of Japanese Canadians through the war and other aspects of history. And other relevant topics of humanities and social sciences also hold a place of importance in this database, particularly things related to multiculturalism, anti-racism, social justice, and so on. So the tagging system that I ended up developing would enable us to improve a little bit of the searching and the browsing capabilities. So tags were added both to the researcher as well as to the resource entries. So for instance, if you click on one specific tag, say sociology field, that's the way that I structured it, it would be basically retrieving all the entries that have sociology field. So all the researchers who have sociology field as a research interest of their own. And then other tags were generation and then field of research, affiliation, associated places, as well as the type of genre and formats. So here's an example of the first curator who founded the Japanese Canadian National Museum, which is currently called the Japanese Canadian National Museum. And now it has a different name, but this was the name that it was founded at that time. And then you have an example of resource entries that indicate the genre under the tags, which is a biography of Jesse Nishihata, who was a pioneer documentary filmmaker and the first person to actually create a documentary that also illustrated the history of Japanese Canadians. Now, in order to develop this tagging system, being a cataloger as well, I'm very fond of established vocabularies. So the type of vocabulary that I decided to use was primarily the Library of Congress subject headings. So you can see examples of some of the entries in there, such as Immigration Canada, motion pictures, production and direction, because we have quite a few people who created documentaries and animated films with Japanese Canadians as their subject. And then in some instances, we had to use Canadian subject headings because, for example, Japanese Canadians, which is a very intuitive type of term, is not available in the Library of Congress subject headings. You are actually forced to use Japanese subdivided by Canada geographical subdivision. So we use Japanese Canadians instead, which would be a little bit more natural for people. Then we also selected Library of Congress genre form terms for the types of formats of resources. So you can see novel genre, documentary films genre, biographies, animated films, and so on and so forth. And then finally, there are times that we didn't want to use any of the established vocabularies because established vocabularies are either lacking, they are not very representative, and in sometimes they can be outright offensive to some of the communities. So you can see that dispossession and redress, which are very recurring themes in Japanese Canadian history, is not really represented in the Library of Congress or Canadian subject headings. So I use natural language and then apply the field. And then picture brides is one of the terms that I also decided to use because the offensive term that appears in Library of Congress subject headings is mail order brides. And this is kind of a screenshot of the tags that have been generated for all these Japanese Canadian researcher entries. And for this one, in particular for this particular collection, and it's sorted according to the number of counts. So you can see that Canada Associated Place is the one that has the highest number of entries because most of them probably are affiliated to Canada in some way. And then Japanese Canadian Identity would be the second one with 139 people, individuals, researchers at the time that I took the screenshot. Since then, I have added a couple more, so the number will be slightly different. Now, when this project was given to me, I had to actually find out what kind of platform we could actually be using to make sure that it was something that it was useful for people, easy to use, and it wouldn't actually be so difficult for us to invest so much time and expertise because both funding and expertise were lacking in many ways in technological aspects. So we needed something that we could create researcher profiles and a list of relevant resources to Japanese Canadians. It had to be a relational database as opposed to just creating a bibliography that was static and you would have to browse and it would be very much difficult to update. And as I said, because it's a nonprofit organization, we had to also choose something that did not cost money, so free was better. And I didn't really need to actually invest so much time in programming, which is something that I wouldn't be able to do anyways. And even though I have some basic knowledge of relational databases, I am not a information architect myself. So it was important for us to actually get something that was more plug and play. And therefore, we decided to start reviewing some of the open access resources that were available out there. And that's when we came across the library thing. and TinyCat. And I believe that many of you probably have already come across the terms library thing and have at least minimally heard about it. And it's something that I always thought that it was more for personal people to organize their personal libraries. But in this case, it also happened that many small organizations are also able to use library thing to organize their book collections or their resources. And library thing itself is a social cataloging application. It is web-based and used by authors, individuals, libraries, and publishers. It has been launched in 2005. With the advent of the pandemic in the 2020, they actually made it completely free. So if you are a registered user of Library Thing, you are not bombarded with advertisement that comes through the platform, which is actually really refreshing because it's always very annoying to actually see all these pop-up things when you're using something that is open access. Oops, cataloging. Okay, so this is the screenshot of the profile that we created for the Japanese Canadian Researchers Directory. You see a little bit of the, on the right-hand side, that it's an organization, non-governmental organization, and it's one of the 30,000 organizations that are using Library Thing for this type of purposes of organizing their collections. You see some of the tags that we have assigned as examples on the top. A little bit of a description of what this collection is about, and then who owns it, and so on and so forth. Now, one of the appealing things of TinyThing is that Library Thing is that it powers Library Cat or TinyCat, and TinyCat is basically the discovery layer that goes on top of Library Thing. So it's an online catalog for small libraries. It does not require extensive programming and database design knowledge. And it was very cost effective, which is the case for us. We needed for a small library, and in our case, a nonprofit organization with very limited budget. So we qualified as a volunteer library. So because our collection is less than 1,000 items currently, we also don't have any paid staff, and we have no collection budget that exceeds $500. In this case, it's $0. So we don't actually buy anything. And therefore, so now we pay about $3 just to have access to this full technology, which is actually very affordable for a nonprofit organization that doesn't have any funds except for the funding for this project. And this is a basic screenshot of what it looks like in the public view. In terms of data collection, we used primarily an appendix in the Japanese Canadians in the Arts Directory of Professionals that was published in 1994. And obviously, a lot has been published since then. So we complemented the type of entries that we would like to include in from the University of Toronto Libraries holdings and the Library and Archives of Canada's holdings. And then there were a couple of academics who were also part of this project, and we used some of their bibliographies that were compiled by them to identify some of the materials of interest. And they are both Professor Jennifer Matsunaga from University of Ottawa and University of Victoria's Professor John Price. Importing data into Library Thing can be actually quite simple. And this is one of the ways that you can actually import your data. So you can use the search on the bottom on the left. As you can see, you can put the name of the author or the ISBN or the title of the book, all separated by comma. And then I also have specified which targets I wanted to use. So in our case was Library of Congress first. If you do not find in Library of Congress, you would go to Vancouver Public Library, Toronto Public Library. Unfortunately, the Library and Archives of Canada is not actually connected to Library Thing, so I couldn't actually make use of that. It would have been much more meaningful for Canada to actually have this in. But for those people who are doing maybe American versions of this project, could actually take advantage of Library of Congress records that would be directly connected. So if there are any instances of those search terms, you can find them on the right-hand side. And basically, these are hyperlinks. And as soon as you click on that hyperlink, the book is automatically, the record is imported into Library Thing, and it's automatically added to the collections that you specify to include it. So this is an example of a record that it would be there, and then you can see the book details view, and it's roughly what someone from the public is going to see. And this is actually the public view of the catalog. Now, there's a lot of things that even though sometimes I brought in records, I still had to do a lot of manual enhancements to them. And this is a particular example that I had to add a lot more information because it was important to identify individual contributors to this particular work. And that's why you see that there are extensive notes about that, even though the rules for when the record was created was editor and others. The other way to import data into LibraryThing, if you cannot use the LibraryThing searching capabilities, is actually to create a CSV, text files, XML. They're all acceptable, and you can prepare in Excel CSV files is the one that I prepared, and haul those records in. And it also allows you to import MARC files. And if you have access to tools such as OCLC Connection, you could do that as well. And these are specifically for examples that you were not able to find through those targets. So, and in my case, there were many times that I actually have to do original cataloging for some of the books that were not existing in the first place, and then create those files and then import them in batches. Now, for anything that I was not able to find either through the OCLC database or through the targets, I had to do manual entries, and that's how you would use a kind of a web form to do that as well. 1 minute. Really? Oh, there's not much to be asked. So data collection in terms of data preparation, with the help of research assistant, we selected this type of information. And then I used book templates to create researcher entries, as you can see here, because they didn't really have a public authority file per se. And this is the type of information that you see, and I have already. Also the hyperlinks will retrieve any works related to this particular researcher, and then vice versa. You could actually go back and forth through the profiles and the resources. Now, there were some limitations. Subject field is not editable, so you had to use OCLC to do so. And if you, LibraryThing recommends using tags instead. There are no parallel fields, so the way that I tried to do was to have Romaji and then followed by the characters. And it also doesn't allow you to, it doesn't normalize with diacritics. So the way that I have to address these limitations was by including the macron in the transliterated forms, and then add as keywords in the notes so that it was searchable. Now, this is the home page. There are some collections that you can browse. I'm going to skip this, and I can actually show you during the Q&A, but anything that you see, always the last added entry comes on top, and then you can use filter functions to sort through them. There's simple keyword search. You all know how it works. Advanced searches, where you want to have more limited kind of narrowed results. And of course, faceted navigation on the side, and this is all powered by LibraryThing. There's a search demonstration if you want. You can go into these links, and I have like a video that I created. And it was important also for us to kind of see how many people would be using. Of course, it's not as popular as the Visas for Life because it's a very narrow audience, but you have the capability of including this to create Google Analytics. And by copying and paste some of the Google Search Console script that is available, and you can see those. Now, in terms of future plans, I would like to enhance some existing entries, continue adding researcher entries, and also explore the inclusion of archival collections, which is something that a lot of the researchers have asked about. Thank you.
Thank you so much for Fabiano-san. Perhaps we have one question. Yes. Christine?
Sorry, I was wondering about what kinds of privacy issues you had to deal with. I don't think with GDPR. Well, first, did you get the permission of the people when you included them, or have they all died, or what kinds of decisions did you have to make with that?
So in terms of privacy issues, as you could see, the majority of them also came from the Japanese Canadian Researchers Directory of Arts. So they were already publicly available anyways. The other ones, they were also profiles that are available in public places, for example, if it were either publications or if it was the university sites. Now, we always give the flexibility for people to actually reach out to us. And if they would like us to actually hide that information, we can always actually take it away if it is the case. But it's very unlikely that we're going to get this type of privacy issues, especially because the whole purpose was actually to increase the visibility for people to be able to use this. So, but yeah, we reserve the right for people to ask us to take that information down.
Yes, perhaps one more brief short question. Anybody? Or online? No?
Very quickly, this is Lynn Kutsukake. She was a Japanese studies librarian at the University of Toronto before
Yes,
me.
we do know her.
Yes.
One of our friends.
Yes.
Old friends.
And since then, after retirement, she became a writer, a novelist. So she also has historical fiction in here as well.
Good.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you so much.